short little stint before we start getting us started on this. My name is Cheryl. I am with DORN Companies. I am our national sales manager. So just wanted to introduce who we are. We are an injury prevention and wellness company. It's been around for about 25 years. And I'm also excited to introduce Dr. Kevin Weaver. He is our partner with US Compliance. They are the leader in environmental health and safety compliance solutions, helping out manufacturers of all sizes to achieve OSHA and EPA compliance efficiently and cost effectively. So we've been working with them for over a year now and have helped many companies with their ergonomics and injury prevention. So if you are attending ASSP Safety 2025 in Orlando, both DORN and US Compliance will be there. So we'll be at separate booths, but please feel free to swing by and say hi to both of us. As we go through the webinar, if you have any questions during the session, we're going to have you just go ahead and submit them in the question and answer box, and we'll go ahead and get a hold of those at the end of our webinar. So here is a quick peek at what our agenda is going to be looking like today. So it's a really busy webinar, and we are covering lots and lots and lots of things. So I want to go ahead and show you one more slide before I hand it over to Kevin. Stay with us throughout the entire webinar. We are giving people an opportunity to win some free Starbucks gift cards. So if you stay all the way through, we will be selecting 10 lucky winners today to get yourself a little coffee treat. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and meet our speaker here. Again, Dr. Kevin, VP of EHS Strategy of US Compliance. Lots and lots of experience here crossing the globe. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Dr.
All
Kevin.
right. Well, thanks, Cheryl. I appreciate that. Really looking forward to talking to everyone today. As we get going, I'll curate the presentation a little bit based on some of the information you've put in. And also, just to kind of give you a flavor, I'd love to get this poll launched. If you can take a quick second and kind of talk about who's responsible for environmental health and safety within the organization. That will allow me to give you a little more focus as we get going. All right, we will start to close this up. And we can see here on the answers, we got a pretty even split. For those that are involved, they have direct responsibility, part of a team that supports EHS, but maybe not directly responsible for EHS. And then people that just want some general awareness because that's important too. And really the takeaway from that is, as you'll see, environmental health and safety isn't one person, right? It's the organization, it's across the organization. So when there are changes and updates and things are happening, it's like there are a lot of people involved, but sometimes there aren't owners. And that creates some of the opportunity we'll talk about today where things can fall apart or where it's just harder to stay on top of it when it's not your full-time job. And so things like this, other seminars you go into will start to give you some of that information. And that's really the theme of where we're going to take this. All right, so what I'm talking about today is largely going to be based as it impacts organizations within the US. I know we had someone from Canada on board. Look, if you catch my accent, you'll see and got some familiarity up there too. But at the same time, a lot of the policies and things we see here do cross borders, right? On a very high level, there's so much sharing of information despite all the recent stuff that there's still a lot of similarities in what we do. So you can expect some of this to start to be the same in either world. Let's say you want to be familiar with it. And in the US, the amount of change in what we've seen lately is almost unsurpassed. And so there are some definite themes, though. You know, it's very common, especially with the new administration, to see a lot of executive orders in that first 30, 90 days. What we saw this round was really beyond anything we've ever seen. And so how does that impact us? And honestly, if I extrapolate this out to 90 days, you'll see that discrepancy even greater. What it means is there's a lot of stuff we need to know. There's a lot of things we have to be on top of. There's a lot of changes that are going to impact us that we need to start looking for. And so what I'm going to do as I go through some of that is really try to narrow it down to what are those big ones that are really starting to impact, especially general industry. The Supreme Court of the United States came out with something called the Chevron ruling. And a lot of people took this in different ways. And really, what it was about is the Supreme Court at times are faced with different decisions, especially as it relates to environmental, even employee health and safety as it gets to things. And what they would do is they'd go back to these federal agencies and ask for interpretations. So if I had an issue on greenhouse gases, I would go to the federal EPA and say, hey, what does it mean at this level? That's what changed. It gave them the ability to go out and ask different players. It gave them the ability to go back to states and ask. And what they really allowed them to do was go above and beyond where they were and get out of some really tight definitions that we've seen. It also did something they called judicial deference. We'd started to see a trend where certain agencies, and a great example would be the Securities and Exchange Commission, they came out with a rule on environmental social governance. Why was the SEC regulating environmental emissions through the ESG rule? And the reason was at the time, the EPA couldn't get around to it. It took an act of Congress. It was a quick and easy way to get it in, and it made sense in some capacities. But what this really did was say agencies need to stay in their lane. They need to focus on where their expertise were, and it started to play a greater role in state involvement. So we'll start to see that. What judicial deference didn't do, or the Chevron ruling didn't do, is it didn't remove anything. It didn't change any of the existing laws. In fact, what it did was, given the state's greater authority, is we're going to see a lot of differences. So we may be doing it one place, but not the other, which means if you have a company in 2 states or 40 states, there was more to start staying on top of. And we'll start to see that play out here over the last year and a half. And really, at the federal level, the themes we're starting to see is around deregulation, right? New rules that were coming in that were going to put all sorts of new burdens on things, that were going to add additional things that didn't exist before. Those have kind of fallen back. And so if they had parts in it, though, that simplified reporting, made things easier, made it faster, scaled back enforcement, that's where we see things starting to go forward. It also, we've seen direct impacts towards enforcement. Overall, especially at the federal level, and at the federal level, enforcement can be huge, and even small organizations, you're normally starting at 6 figures. There are going to be fewer routine inspections, fewer just random inspections, things that people see. But the counter of that is generally the fines are going to be more, and violation potential's gone up. And we'll talk about that. We're also seeing a rise, which we'll get into, on what we call citizen-led enforcement. There's so much transparency in what we do and reporting and the ability to see things now. And part of that transparency, there's a direct line into new lawsuits, new advocacy groups, and holding certain violators accountable. And we're even seeing that a little bit at the state level. And so we're getting much, much more, not just public groups and NGOs, but we're seeing more state and even local down to the county and city level enforcement. So a big piece of that will be going in. So what does this mean for operations running? It means you need to be on top of your stuff. You need to be aware of where you're at. And there are some corporate responsibility initiatives you have to undergo, right? Although some of these rules have rolled back, the transparency is greater than it ever was. The enforcement is greater than it ever was. So you need visibility into the organizations. And we'll talk a little bit about how people are doing that. So it's not wait for the new regulation to come up. It's be proactive, identify where these needs are going to be, and start addressing them now. Because citizen-led enforcement, these advocacy groups getting in there, may not have nothing to do with regulations. So where we focused a lot of our world on compliance and the world of regulations, it's starting to have a lesser effect. And we're getting into much more advanced areas. Think about something as simple as a rollback on a federal heat stress rule. We know it's significant. We know the impacts are significant. We're in the summer. If you're in 90 degrees all day long, it's going to be a problem. Well, California's longstanding heat stress rule in there. So if you have an operation in California and an operation in Texas, one says you need to go out and you need to put some basic things in place. Shade, water, breaks, training on employees on signs, symptoms, and what to do. Well, Texas, the rule was rescinded at the state level, and federally, it's not there. Do we have to do anything? Legally, no. But in reality, an organization with operations in both those states, we know there's detrimental impacts to the organization on just how things are held. You know, God forbid if there was ever a major incident or anything happen on, it's like, wow, we don't care about our employees. Think about the impact that has on morale, employee safety, just having discrepancies and treating people different. And it does open up legal risks. As an organization, you identify you need to do this in California, but you don't in other areas. Well, you've identified it's a liability, it's a risk, right? So we can't ignore it in other areas. So even when the rule does not exist, those differences can be real for organizations. So that's why you typically are going to the highest level. You're holding a corporate standard, and we'll see things start to play out in this. So even when the rules don't exist, and some of these rollbacks we're going to talk about, don't exist, it doesn't relinquish the responsibility for taking action up front. Now, we'll talk a little bit today about workplace safety. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the major environmental things. There's been a lot that happens at OSHA, and OSHA operates on a federal standard. States can go above and beyond it. About 2/3 of the states have state-run programs that literally go quite a bit above and beyond. But again, there's a lot of familiarity with those federal rules as well. Well, one of the first big changes, and I get asked about all the time, was NOSHA. There was an early proposal put out there to eliminate OSHA. We were dropping off a lot of rules. It's like, you know what, let's get rid of federal OSHA, kind of like the Federal Education Department. Although that was out there, there's a lot of rumors OSHA's not going anywhere. And so OSHA will persist. It's been there since 1970. It will continue far into the future. But one of the things I will say with OSHA is we won't see as many changes. And the changes we do see will kind of fall in line with what we talked about. There were a number of proposed standards that were aimed to come into place earlier this year. And although a lot of these are still out there, we'll probably see those continue to be delayed and even eventually removed. The first one, which we kind of touched on, was the heat stress. It's an issue. It's rolled back, but it still persists. The final rule may come out. I don't expect to see it, not in the next 4 years. But that said, we might see more and more states get involved. Right now, we have 5 states with specific rules. We will more than likely see other states fall in line with that in the upcoming time. Very similar, HAZCOM, there was an update that is kind of held back now, but there's still some rules that are out there. Right now, they're tentatively coming into place around labeling in 2026, 2027. Right? So although those changes are there, they're likely to be pushed back as well. But right now, we're going to see that there are probably things you want to do. They're going to align with what federal changes are. So again, although the rule may not go forward, it's still probably things you want to do. So if you do a lot of labeling within your organization, now's the time to start understanding those changes and start to plan and budget for what those changes might be here over the next 2 years. The walk around rule was a pretty big change coming out there. It almost immediately got some pending litigation against it that's going to hold it for a few years. And again, it probably will not roll through. And really, what that's about, if you've seen it or if you do start to see some changes about it, is it allowed third parties like union heads to participate doing OSHA inspections. Other than that, pretty straightforward. And there was a notice out there, an emergency response rulemaking. I don't expect anything to change there in the future. We'll hit on these as we get to the end too. If you have questions, we can dig into a little bit. The other piece that's been impacted in a pretty big way is OSHA has what they call national emphasis programs, or NEPs. NEPs kind of target those industries where they know there's a little bit more danger. There's been maybe a lack of enforcement, a lack of compliance, and it kind of tells them where they can start to focus some of the very limited resources they have. And so all of these topics you see here were the current national emphasis programs. And so those are still in place. There is one on amputations in manufacturing. Generally, these are in place for 5 years. This one got renewed. And so they said, you know what, the amputation inspections is a pretty important part of what we do. We don't want to drop it. They're continuing it. And there was a small change in there. And what they really did was they expanded it to quite a few number of industries. So if you have time, you can get in there. You can look at the amputations NEP. You'll see all those general industry SIC NAICS codes, and it'll tell you, hey, we're in this industry. It is something we need to be prepared for. It's something that if one occurs, you're going to get an inspection. You know, everyone always says, well, compliance is kind of expensive. You know, non-compliance is about 1,000 times worse. And I think it's always important to just kind of understand where things kind of lay. Really, I'm going to start with OSHA. So federal enforcement and state largely falls in line with this. If you get an OSHA inspection, many of you have probably been through these at different times. I've been on site well over 100 at this point, and you can expect to see if you're generally doing things are in placement. It's not uncommon to have a fine between maybe anywhere from $5,000 to $30,000 for a routine inspection, and you weren't expecting this. If you get into something more serious, a complaint, an injury, those numbers go up significantly. And OSHA has the ability to levy up to $16,550 per fine for both serious and what they call non-serious citations. And so when they get outside of that, right, and one citation is generally not the case, it can be several. When you get into what they call that willful or repeat violation, someone in your organization has had a similar fine within the last 5 years, or you have documentation saying this is a problem, could be an injury report, could be an inspection, and it's still not fixed. That's what we call willful. You were told you needed to fix something, it didn't happen. You knew you needed to do something, you decided not, it was expensive. Those escalate by exponentially, and they can go up to $165,000 per violation. And you know, generally people are well aware. It's like, wow, that could be an OSHA fine. And I don't want to use scare tactics, but OSHA typically expect anywhere from fives to tens of thousands if you get a citation, or you're going through those that you got to deal with an organization. You know, anywhere from again 5 to 25 is pretty typical for a routine inspection. It's not uncommon for that to approach into the $75,000 range. When we start talking about federal EPA, it's a whole other animal. When I'm working with companies, I generally tell them, hey, if you get an EPA fine and it's under 6 figures, it actually had probably a pretty good inspection. They do it a little differently. Numbers vary by the media. RCRAs, when we're talking about waste, water, public information, it's the CERCLA, APCRA, or air emissions. You can see that an individual fine has a pretty high number. Now, there's a lot of calculation goes in this. It's kind of based on the size of the facility. But here's sort of how they look at it. Take a very simple situation. We have a hazardous waste drum of material. Maybe it's waste paint. It's some kind of solvent from whatever it happens to be. We got to get rid of it. It's dirty. It can't be used. It's been sitting there a little while. In a little while doesn't have to be very long, you know, even take a few days. Um, but it's not labeled properly. It's a requirement under RCRA to have a hazardous waste label on there. 93,000. If it was labeled properly, it would have been caught on the required weekly inspection at another 93. If we had trained people to look for the labels and do the weekly inspections, they would have been happening. So we've got an improper training. We're now at 185, over $180,000 per day. Now, if it's been sitting there for 65 days, and this can go back up to 3 years, you're into $18 million on something that simple. Now, we take a look at a couple things. There's a major adjustment based on largely facility size. And facility size is based on total revenue overall. It won't be $18 million, but it won't be 18,000 either. Expect that to be somewhere in that six-figure range. On an EPA inspection, anywhere from 50 to maybe 300,000 is pretty typical for that medium-sized business. Anywhere from, I'd say, $10 to $50 million annual revenue. It goes up. It goes up a lot. We've seen them with some of the automotive manufacturers. If you think about some of the emission scandals on cheating tailpipe emissions, it was that number of 125,000 for the Clean Air Act times 400,000 cars in place times 3 years. And some of that company received over $1 billion fine. So the EPA has almost infinite resources, time, and ability to levy fines. Don't risk the EPA stuff. Now, expanding on that, a lot of the EPA stuff has remained the same, and it's hard, right? The OSHA CFR, if you see, it's like this long. The EPA CFR is about 12 feet. And so as we get into this, one of the big new things is around what we call forever chemicals, PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances. And there's what they call the chemical substance reporting rules. This has been one of the single biggest changes we've seen, because they're relatively newly discovered. There are a group of different chemicals. So when we talk about them, sometimes we talk about specific, sometimes we talk about the group. So why do we care? If we've seen some of the movies or documentaries that they let you know, but we slowly discovered they're in everybody. We've also discovered at some level they impact health pretty significantly. And we don't know what that level is. There was a rule out there that said 4 parts per trillion. 4 parts per trillion is on ballpark 3 drops in 250 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's infinitesimally small. It's to the point where it's not even, you can't visualize a number that small. Well, how did they even come up with this? Well, how they did it was they went to the top analytical labs, and the lowest level they can detect to was 4 parts per trillion. If they put it at 2 parts per trillion, we just didn't have the equipment to even test. So essentially, it was at 0. Now, if we back that up a bit, and I'm going to ballpark over to safety programs when you think of things, right? We want to be compliant. We know 100% is a really difficult number to please, but you know what? We put all this effort in, we're 90% compliant. Sometimes the effort to go from 90 to 95% is almost the same. So when we think about 4 parts per trillion and getting to 0 and all the potential sources, which we'll get into here in a minute, it was like, wow, is that even possible? How much effort does it take? How do we even get to 4 parts per trillion? And, whether it's 4 parts per trillion or let's say 100 parts per trillion, 100 parts per trillion is still incredibly small. We're down to maybe 30 drops in 250 Olympic pools. And so did that make sense? And the reality was we don't know. And under the new administration, the EPA kind of acknowledged that. Now, they acknowledged a couple things. One, PFAS is an absolute top priority, but we don't know what that effort should be. We know 4 might be very aggressive and not even realistic. So that is held back right now on the federal level as we come up with new limits, and they're coming. We're not sure what the right number is. And so there's a lot of reporting. There's going to be a lot of changes, and we're starting into some of this. So if you've seen that number roll back, you're in a handful of counties in the country that say zero. Again, zero is not something we can even define. It's right now it's defined at 4 parts per trillion. So we're going to see that change. But look, whether it's 4 parts per trillion or 4,000 parts per trillion, effectively it's zero for all of us because it's such a small number. But that hasn't stopped things from going forward. There's a lot of surveys and questions being asked right now. And we're seeing it largely from the state, county, city. A lot of it's driven by wastewater entities. So your local water plant, your local POTW, they're starting to ask, hey, do you guys have PFAS? They're just getting information. This is routine stuff. There's no fines. We're not saying you can't have it. There's no limits. There's no thresholds. Well, what are they doing? The title of this is evidence gathering. And that's exactly what's happening. We actually started to see this play out largest and earliest in the state of Wisconsin. Now, if you've ever been to the US Midwest in Madison, it's a mid-sized city, not huge, largely a college town, but they got a lot going on. They also have a lot of PFAS going on. And they're like, you know what? We don't want it in our water supply. Look, you can put any survey you want out there. Nobody wants this stuff, that we want to get rid of it. And so they looked at treatment operations for their water plant. And they said, you know what? Yeah, we can do it. We looked at the volume. It's going to be about $200 million to put a system in. It's going to be about 40 million annually to maintain the system. Wausau did not have, or sorry, Wausau did not have 250 million to put into this system. What are they going to do? They reached out to all the manufacturers that they thought likely to have PFAS, and they said, you know what, we want you to pay for it. And they leveraged lawsuits against them for having it and causing contamination in the drinking water. They contribute to that, and they used that money to pay for it. That model has worked out, and they've said, you know what, this is the only realistic way we can do this. So when that survey's going out saying you have PFAS, you're thinking, yeah, we probably do. Yes, be aware, this is where it's heading, to the point where this is where it was heading in 2024 on federally. And this is a small fraction. This is only the federal lawsuits. The county, the state, the city lawsuits are above and beyond this. And they were coming out like, now we're going to figure out treatment systems and we're going to sue all those local entities. Now, I will say in January of this year, the federal EPA was frozen on this due to lawsuits. These are held off. We're not adding new lawsuits at the federal level, but we are seeing a lot of them at the state and local level. And we will see that trend go on, and we're going to see that the next 10, 20 years until these things are out of the system. But it's going to take hundreds of millions of dollars to get there, and it's going to take a long time. So it's not going away. It's paused. It's things that when they're in your system, taking that out now is a big part of it. In fact, federally, one of the major rules was there's something called a toxic release inventory. Larger manufacturers report on this. You may know it as a Form R or a Form A report. It was just recently due here. The federal deadline's July 1st. And it reports on chemicals classified as what they call special concern, chemicals of special concern. PFAS falls into that. Now, it only reported on certain PFAS substances. There was about 200 on the list. They added 7 this year. Next year, they're adding 9 more. So we're up to about 216. There's about 4 million PFAS compounds out there. But if you had these 207 that are most common and you did over 100 pounds over an entire year, you had to report without any consideration for low levels. So if you checked one of those city surveys, and again, think about the transparency in laws now and how easy it is to find this, said you had it, well, boy, you better be able to say, not only do we have it, here's how many pounds. And so those are going out. And again, this is just public information at this point, but you can see we're starting to build those deadlines. Now, a lot of people, what they do is when they first go out to find PFAS is they look at their safety data sheets. Well, SDSs are required to put hazardous chemicals on there when they're 1% or more. Well, 1% of a part per million is 10,000. It doesn't have to be on an SDS. Well, how the heck do you find this information? Right now, it's working with suppliers. It's working with up and down the stream. It's working with industry association to find out where does PFAS exist in our operation. And that's been a really hard thing for companies to really start to gauge. And I'll tell you the short answer, everyone has it. It's purely a question of how much. This is a slide, and we can share this later as well. But you will see, whatever industry you're in, and these are some of the heavy hitters, it's in there. Even you think in food manufacturing, it's not necessarily in the food, but it's almost at 99% level in the packaging. So wherever you are, it's not always even looking at the primary products you're making and producing, but it's all those secondary things, containers in a big way, packaging. A lot of times hide this stuff. And a lot of times it's also in general production and it won't be on the SDS. And so you may not even know you have it. And sometimes people are literally taking some of their common stuff, they're going to labs and testing for it. Now, getting away from PFAS and starting to talk about this, there's a lot of laws, even internationally, that start to hit us. I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental social governance, ESG. It was a real hot topic. It's kind of rolled back a little bit, but there's some things still going on in the EU that will impact us over here. And one of them is what they call the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. They like to make things a handful. I'm just glad I don't say it in German. When we have this, and it hit in the US, and many of you may know, and I touched early on, the Securities and Exchange Commission had a very comprehensive ESG rule. That's been held back. While that's been held back, Europe said, you know what, we're going forward. And then all of a sudden they got a little bit of pushback. And they're like, you know what? All of a sudden, all these US manufacturers are not doing what we thought they were going to do on the timeline we thought we were going to do it. So they came out with something called the Simplification Omnibus. Essentially, Europe was backing off on some of the ESG requirements because the US at the federal level was backing off on a lot of these requirements too. And so if Europe was going to impose requirements on US manufacturers, they knew that wouldn't be very positive. So they've rolled it back. They've gone after what they call the very large filers. You're over 1,000 employees, you're over 500 million in net revenue, and they've pushed it out to 2028. A lot of these rules were going to come in yet this year. Now, the European laws even affect us. It completely does, because when we want to do business with Europe, when we have sister facilities in Europe, we're going to get under these. And so this directive puts out a lot of those ESG elements, establishing very basics on human rights and environmental impacts. And so it does have a global impact because there's just that global interaction with so many businesses. It also was tying together three requirements. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which hit a lot of financial organizations. So if you're owned by PE, you were getting questionnaires and a lot of input on this as well as the EU taxonomy, which just simply said if you're in certain organizations, you're going to have to do these things. But again, on the federal level, we came back and we said, you know what? That's going to be a problem here in the US. We don't want that. So they've actually launched rules. We're going to see those come through. This was part of the omnibus simplification to say that, you know what, we don't want our US companies impacted by this. So it's been held off. And I think most importantly to say it's been held off, we are going to see some version of this come back. And it's going to take a lot of time. It may not be this year, it may not be next, but we're going to see it. And we're going to see it more and more, I think, through just internal responsibilities and implications companies put on themselves because of the transparency with the public. And we'll get into a little bit of that. It's also going to be driven a little more by these two things: individual states and what we call citizen level enforcement. which we talked on a little bit earlier. So it's great. States want to step up, but it creates a patchwork when you're a multi-site facility. It literally, to the point, one state requires you to do something, the next one doesn't. Sometimes on things like heat stress, it makes sense to come across with that corporate rule. Sometimes things like reporting on environmental emissions, it gets more complicated. And we're also starting to see certain states now combine requirements. Climate disclosures on greenhouse gas emissions was a big one. New York, Colorado, and California said, you know what, let's join. We're going to require it for anyone working in our 3 states. And they get some efficiencies on rules and enforcement and combining things. But all of a sudden, we have smaller states coming together. And that's very different. We've not seen that before, but it's a trend I expect to see a lot more of. And so your role in this right now is you have to start doing more monitoring at the level where your operations exist, especially in those multi-site scenarios, because it won't be the same answer state to state. Almost immediately, Colorado come out and said, you know what, you're getting rid of the greenhouse gas rule. We don't announce we want it. And so if you want to do business in the state of Colorado, environment is pretty strong for us. Our people care about the state of the environment, and we want our businesses disclosing greenhouse gases. So with that rollback at the federal SEC level, the state of Colorado stood up and said, you know what, it's going to come there. Now, that's been administratively stayed legally, so it's being held off. And I do mean held off. It will come through. That's my prediction. And general consensus seems to say probably in 2026. So if you're there, this is one of the things on your list to check on. And how often do you check on something like this? Once every 3 to 6 months is probably pretty normal. Now, there were a couple cases, and we talk about citizen level enforcement, Held versus the state of Montana. This was a case filed in 2020. You had 16 youth residents, and they literally at the time ranged between the ages of 2 and 18. So now imagine a group of 16 youth, right down to a 2-year-old, coming up in front of the judge saying that, you know what, we care. We believe we have a constitutional right to clean, healthful environment. We want clean air. We want the state to consider greenhouse gas emissions in any environmental review going forward because we think greenhouse gases exacerbate climate change. Look, you'd have to be made of absolute stone to sit there and say, we don't care. We don't agree. Right. And so in this case, as it went through, it went to the Montana Supreme Court because it got appealed and eventually got to the Supreme Court of the state of Montana. And they said, you know what? We agree with you. And we are going to put this requirement in. And so as this rolls out in the state of Montana, any new big operations, especially you think power plants, and they've got a lot of them, they're going to have to consider the impacts of greenhouse gas in these new expansions. And that is how citizen-led enforcement is going to happen. Now, what's really interesting about this case actually fed from another case at the federal level called Juliana versus the United States. It was actually launched in 2015. 21 youth came and had the exact same argument. And this went to the federal level. And so now we're at the US Supreme Court. And they came back and said, you know what? After several appeals, we don't agree. So federally, this is now dead. On a state level, exact same thing is now alive. And so this is on that theme of federally, we're not going to see a lot of new things come in, but we're going to see a lot of those states that do care in the same way. And these advocate groups are going to go and start leveling this at the state level. And so in a big way, that's what we're starting to see. Now, and all of this is getting exacerbated by a lot of other things, and not the least of some of the technological advancements, which I'll just briefly touch on here as we kind of close out our hour, just for everyone to figure out what's going on. And it's really about integration of technology, not the least of which is AI. And if you're not in there now, be in there. It is going to drive a lot of what we do. And so, I don't want to discount the human factor, especially in the areas of health, safety, environmental, But in reality, AI is going to drive a lot of what we do. And here's some of the ways it's hitting today. And remember, we're in its infancy right now. Some call predictive analytics, which I'll talk about. Internet of Things, real-time monitoring. Imagine I have a sensor I'm working in the field that monitors temperature. I've got 100 people working in the field. I can see all of them right now in a certain state where it's at, and all of a sudden it flags based on temperature. It's measuring dry bulb go weight and says, hey, we got issues. You need to stop people right now. We need to get more breaks in because it's getting to a certain level, and we can get to things before they happen. Even in compliance, you think a lot of times we're filling out forms, we're plugging in emissions, we have spreadsheets, and then we go out and fill other forms. A lot of that goes away and we get to the endpoint a lot faster. Incident investigation, root cause, I'll talk about here in a minute, and that directs right into employee training. Sustainability, what are our impacts? How are we getting there? We're starting to see answers a lot faster because these things are getting automated. Even at the state level, if you've ever applied for an air permit, this can take months, years. There's a software company out there now that a lot of states are starting to use, and you submit these forms, it goes in, AI looks at them, they kick it out almost immediately. State of Virginia is one of the first using it. And it's taking approvals from years and several months to literally days and weeks. And the holdup is now at the applicant stage. And so we're going to see things speed up. The reason this is going through, it speeds up. It allows us to get approvals faster, it allows us to do new operations faster. And super helpful when we start to see that. I talked about predictive analytics. Here's the scenario, and imagine this for your organization. Take every incident, near miss report, every OSHA 300 log filing you've ever had in the history of the company and feed it into an AI model. Now I want to deliver a training based on the high risk scenarios. And I want you to do a skill evaluation of every employee and every job function. And I want to address that training to fit the gaps in those job functions. Now create a training for me and do it in VR so people can be familiar. We can put on the goggles. We can walk through a scenario before it ever happens. That's already happening. And there are a lot of companies. And if you're with Cheryl and I at ASSP next week, you're going to see an explosion of this, where you can now go in and create these highly customized, relevant trainings. Some of the most impactful stuff we've ever done in minutes, where it took a lot of us months. And we're going to see that continue. And so it's a huge positive. So as a lot of this starts to go forward, and we could talk for days on it. And I really, things to think about. I've got regulatory changes slow and fast. Some things are going to slow down, disappear. Some things are going to speed up and be more painful than ever, in terms of having to stay on top of it. And really, what the challenge is going to be is getting to those state level, even local, down to the city level concerns and being able to monitor what those are. But also get outside of that regulatory piece where you're starting to look at what are public concerns. We've had rollbacks on ESG. It doesn't mean public isn't concerned about the other things that were involved in that. Look at what's happening within the supply chain. Look at what's happening within local associations, right? Because when it's happening in the rest of your industry, some version of it's coming to you. And whether it becomes litigation led, it's transparency led through questions, or just it eventually becomes a rule at some level, you're going to have to fall into it and incorporate technology as part of that answer. It's going to be more impactful and drive everything we've been doing. Now, that is a ton to pile into a short, very short kind of a time frame here. So I think at this point, we'll start to wrap up, and we can certainly take a few questions with the group.
Thank you, Dr. Kevin. That was a plethora of information. And again, we are going to be in Orlando next week. So if you have more detailed questions, feel free to come to either of our booths. We did have a few trickle in, so I will go ahead and ask this one for you. How much are our regulators conducting formal reviews with the subject matter experts, SMEs out there?
So if we go back to the SCOTUS ruling on kind of the judicial deference piece there, where they used to go back, and that Chevron ruling. The subject matter experts were the EPA, federal OSHA. Now that they go outside of that, they are starting to get to these industry experts, largely through associations and largely through state authorities. So more of it, it's still probably not where it should be. Look, I'd say if it was before it was 1%, we'd get outside of maybe federal OSHA. At this point, we're probably maybe in that 10 to 15% range. But you know what? It's trending in the right direction.
That's all you can ask for. Okay, another question I have here is how do the EU supply chain rules of due diligence affect US companies?
Really, a couple of ways here. So the EU, especially when you have those sister facilities, your suppliers or even customers are in the EU, there's a direct linkage. The second part of that, even as they do things, and we may not agree whatsoever with some of these changes,
Yeah.
but you know what? Nobody's at 100% agreement on anything these days. 51% is a major win. So with transparency, people hearing about what's going on, EU-led companies advertising it, marketing it. We're greener, we're more recyclable, we're more sustainable. We know the public wants that. That's going to start to drive public opinion. And that's going to start to drive where we want our products going and where people should be going. So we will see more of it. And no matter what we do, what they do will impact us. And so we want to be aware of those changes and we want to know eventually they're coming down the pipe on some version.
Makes sense. All right. I also have how should companies handle differences in state level rules, especially around heat stress and injury?
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit when you start to get into some of those state differences. And for those of you who are in multi-state, even multi-country scenarios, you want to understand first all the rules and requirements, and then you generally take yourself to that higher standard, right? So if we know we got an operation in California and heat stress is a concern for us, we better have it across the organization, right? And that's what we want to have in place. Now, my one counter on that, which we touched briefly on, is when we get into those environmental rules. Generally, with the environmental rules, you want to follow the requirements for those specific locations or geographies, and you don't want to expand those. So if you have emission reporting in the state of Colorado, but you're in the state of Kansas, you don't want to do it for both. You're just going to do it for that state.
Got it. All right. Any other questions that I'm not seeing? Okay. If there are that have come up that you think about later on, because again, Dr. Kevin did supply an enormous amount of information for us. Here is his contact information, so you can get a hold of him directly. So I'll leave that up there for a few seconds so that people can scan what they need to.
Yeah, it was a great chance. I mean, as most of you probably understand, a lot of what we talked about today could go on for days and weeks. So we just got to highlight a lot of it. If there's specifics and you want to get in there, Cheryl and I are resources for you. Would love to talk to you further on any of it.
Absolutely. With that said, I again thank you for staying for as long as you have. Please go ahead and give this QR code a scan, and with this, we can get us over to a opportunity to get yourself a Starbucks card. It'll go to the LinkedIn page so we can follow you, and we'll reach out later today to let you know if you are a winner. Want to reiterate again, we are going to be at ASSP next week. Both of us, US Compliance and DORN, will have a booth. Specifically, US Compliance will be at booth number 1075, and DORN is going to be at 1726. And we do have an opportunity to win some great prizes there as well between the two of us. So I've got that up there. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. We would love to stay connected with you. You'll see a QR code that I already had back a few. So again, feel free to scan to connect with Kevin on LinkedIn. And we really appreciate you all being with us today. Kevin, any
Thanks,
additional?
folks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all.